professor of English and comparative literature, as well as currently she's still the director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race at Columbia University until the end of the semester, I believe.
Yep.
And she's a scholar who specializes in 19th and 20th century Caribbean and U.S. Latino literatures and cultures, with a strong focus in media and popular cultural studies, as well as in ethnicity studies in ethnicity and race. She has authored several books and edited several books, including she authored the book Boricua Pop, Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American Cultures. She published a book of poetry titled An Anatomy of a Smile and Other Poems. And she edited several books, including Puerto Rican Jam, Rethinking Nationalism and Colonialism, and None of the Above, Puerto Ricans in the Global Era, and Sovereign Act. Professor Negra Montaner is also a very accomplished filmmaker, and she has completed several documentaries, among them AIDS in the Barrio, Brincando el Charco, Portrait of a Puerto Rican, and War in Guam. Currently, she's working on 2 projects that I'm very excited about and looking forward to seeing or reading about, which is a documentary on the intersection of Latino and LGBT social movements. And she's also writing a much anticipated intellectual biography of Arthur Schomburg. She has received several prestigious grants, and I'm not going to list them all. And she is a board member, as well as the past chair of the National Association of Latino Independent Producer. And she co-founded a really important initiative here at Columbia University, which is the Latino Arts and Activist Archive. And there are some other things I could mention, but we'll get started, and we will have a presentation, and then we'll engage in a brief conversation and open it up to questions from the audience.
Great, thank you so much. So the first thing I should say about this talk is that it's not really an academic paper. It kind of was elicited in some ways from an Argentinian journal called Todavía. So it was meant for a broad audience, but it answers a question that I've been asked over time repeatedly, which is precisely why is Cuba sexy and Puerto Rico not? And it would come at all kinds of different conversations. And of the many anecdotes that I could start with, I'll start with one real story, which was I was pitching a project to an editor of a major editorial house in the U.S., and what I was pitching was an intellectual biography of Julia de Burgos, who's a Puerto Rican poet and feminist icon, whose name, thanks to the very large number of Puerto Ricans in the United States, can literally be found in many public spaces. For instance, I'll give you an example. There's a Julia de Burgos Boulevard in New York. There's a Julia de Burgos mural. There's a Julia de Burgos stamp. There are Julia de Burgos cultural centers. There are Julia de Burgos libraries. You name it. There's potentially hundreds of public spaces in the United States named after her. In fact, she might be the poet that more things are named after in the U.S. that most Americans don't know. But to that pitch, he simply said, nah. No. The only Latino, and I don't know what he would think about being called Latino, but he said the only Latino that I would publish a biography of is Jose Marti. I'm like, wow. I said, well, I think he deserves many biographies. I don't have any problem with that. But I said, why? I mean, he was so adamant about it. Why Jose Marti? And he said, because he comes from a sexy country. And I said, but he's not kind of sexy, but, I mean, Julia de Burgos, on the other hand, I think has potential, more potential in that sense. But I could convince him of that. We moved to something else. We agreed on working on something else. But it kind of stayed with me that how is it possible that a country that has produced Rita Moreno, Benicio del Toro, Jennifer Lopez, 5 Miss Universes, is not thought of just a little bit sexy, just a little bit. It didn't seem to add up. So I decided that I was going to inquire into this matter about why Although Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico might be considered as appetizing ingredients in the American casserole, Puerto Rico is something else. And it seemed to me that it was not a trivial question, because the fact that Puerto Rico is not perceived that way by the U.S. had actually had consequences throughout history. And so to start, I would say that ever since that Cuba and Puerto Rico entered American Republic's field of vision, you know, Cuba has always been considered much more attractive. One, it was bigger, it was more elegant, but above all, it was closer. And this proximity is not only physical, it's also emotional. It's almost as if Cuba is the Achilles heel of the U.S., whose possession by another could bring about the destruction of the republic itself, the U.S. Republic. In fact, the fear that a country other than Spain would govern Cuba, or that a revolution would create another Haiti in Cuba, reached such a height that between 1823 and 1897, the United States made attempts to purchase the island no fewer than 4 times. To be in control of Cuba's destiny became an American obsession. Now, if you grew up in Puerto Rico like I did, this is the map of the Caribbean that you grew up with. And this map could be, you know, you go out to eat at a restaurant in any number of spaces. You're going to see this map, and it's going to be your mat, it's going to be on TV, it's going to be in school. Now, what's interesting to me comparing the map is that Cuba is nowhere near the U.S. because the U.S. doesn't appear on the map. So Cuba is our neighbor in the Caribbean, just Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Haiti, and the smaller islands in the Caribbean. But the U.S. plays very little role. But when you look at it from this point of view, is when you start to understand that the American point of view of the Republican elite's point of view, Cuba actually is not only very close to it, it seems that it's guarding it between Florida and Central America and protecting all the inside of the United States. So in fact, Americans started to think about Cuba as their own boundary or border rather than Florida. So when the United States finally took up arms in the manner during the Spanish-American War, the obsession with Cuba as an object of desire intensified, eliciting fantasies that were both libidinous and politico-economic. The press represented the island in innumerable caricatures and narratives as a beautiful young woman or a starved mother crying out for a savior who could rescue her from a monstrous Spain. Now, some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the many hundreds of caricatures that I'm referring to. This is like a lady in distress. This is monstrous Spain stuffing over everybody. This is McKinley saying, "I'll take care of this lady now." And then after the war, this is Cuba being taught how to ride a bike, which is a metaphor for self-government that actually reoccurs later, not that long ago, in the Iraq war, where Iraqis were also represented as learning to ride a bike. The exclusion in imagery of the pro-independence Mambi army, or the Cubans that are other than the damsel in distress, makes it clear that Uncle Sam was interested only in saving Cuba and not Cubans, who wanted nothing else than free Cuba from themselves. Or as historian Luis A. Perez has said, on the surface it looked like the war was against Spain, but in fact the war was against Cubans. Before this moment, Puerto Rico had hardly been mentioned in public American discourse, but as the military campaign pushed forward on land and sea, references to the island became more frequent. Unlike those about Cuba, however, the taking of Puerto Rico with an O is always described as a cold and passionate imperial calculation. Politicians and experts agreed on the island's strategic advantages, military opportunities, business prospects. They also added that it was a bit too small to self-govern, so by possessing it, the United States would eliminate competition from other empires and eliminate the Spanish presence from the Americas. The press furthermore reported in short articles, I mean, we're talking about teeny tiny articles, that suggested or reinforced the importance that editors granted to the effort, that it was Puerto Ricans and not Americans who were excited, like literally excited, for the imminent invasion. But Puerto Rico is not not simply some other thing when compared to Cuba, it is also something else, almost impossible to represent. Michigan Senator Julius Boros summarized while discussing developing events after the invasion of Cuba with several colleagues, including McKinley. What we want now is Puerto Rico, and we will have that tomorrow. So this idea that Puerto Rico is kind of a thing and a lesser thing than Cuba is very evident. Like here, Cuba is the steak and Puerto Rico is a pig. Following the Treaty of Paris and already in possession of the islands, the U.S. imposed military governments in both Cuba and Puerto Rico with the intention of conforming the adjacent islands to their needs. While there were sectors of the U.S. public that opposed this turn of events, other voices predominated. In this moment, the Cuban belle was swapped for a black child who, similar to his Puerto Rican and Filipino twins, needed Uncle Sam to guide them in the art of self-government indefinitely. So that's when these caricatures begin. So up to that point, pretty much Cuba was a light-skinned woman, and then becomes one of the little ones, the little brown ones, in Bush's terms, that were acquired in the U.S., by the U.S. All the while, in spite of the Americans who saw themselves as superior to Cubans and Puerto Ricans, the epic saga of Cuban independence was brought Cubans closer to the United States. What is paradoxical is that since Puerto Ricans saw Americans as they saw themselves, liberators of Spanish oppression and defenders of humanity, islanders appeared twice as inferior and undesirable in the American imagination. Expectedly, when the question of what to do with Puerto Rico, and that's literally what the question was raised in public discourse, a comparison between Cubans and Puerto Ricans was quickly drawn. In the words of influential U.S. Congressman Henry Teller, author of the amendment that precluded the annexation of Cuba by the United States, he said, "I don't like the Puerto Rican. They are not fighters like the Cubans. They were under Spanish tyranny for centuries without showing enough manhood to oppose it. Such a race is unworthy of U.S. citizenship." The result is as ironic as it was created. While the desire to annex Cuba culminated in what Americans conceded Cubans their independence, they perceived the island as an integral part of the land and country. In other words, although Cuba became independent, it was imagined as part of the United States. Puerto Rico, on the other hand, is annexed outright, although the U.S. legally denies that it's part of the American national body. This is made possible by the discourse of the unincorporated territory doctrine, which establishes that the island belongs to, but is not part of the United States. Although the U.S. extended citizenship to Puerto Rican residents in 1917, this had little to do with any newfounded sense of solidarity, affection, or attraction for Puerto Ricans. Rather, it was realpolitik. The objective was to suppress any separatist sentiments and to prevent the growing Puerto Rican unrest with the colonial regime from becoming a hostile front during World War I. It is for that reason that the indulgence of citizenship was preceded by numerous clarifications made by the U.S. government and the Supreme Court that in no way was the gesture to be understood as political inclusion. It is also for that reason that citizen status was by name only. Puerto Ricans could now carry passports with a gilded eagle and fly freely into the territory, but they did not have the right to vote for president or to elect a delegation with a voice or a vote in Congress. This dread that a triple P place like Puerto Rico, poor, puny, and passive, would become a state of the Union accounts for the meager concessions that Americans have extended to Puerto Rico. If Americans don't really feel much for the island, they will be damned if they're going to let anyone take it. In the words of then appointed Governor Arthur Yeager, citizenship awarded to Puerto Ricans simply indicated this: we have determined that the American flag will never be lowered in Puerto Rico. Once the war in Europe concluded, American attraction for Cuba eagerly returned to its original metaphor, sexuality. And this is, you have a boom of images that start to look like this. The one in the left is promotional for American tourism. The one in the right is from a Cuban publication becoming a bit critical. And this is Uncle Sam looking a bit lecherous. At the same time, corporate interests conceived of Cuba as a virgin island full of possibilities. These two came together in the tourist gaze, which eroticized and exoticized Cuba, creating a parallel between economic control and sexual domination. From the roaring 20s to the lost decade of the 50s, Americans made Cuba their go-to destination for the 3 Ds: dancing, drinking, and dealing cards. Puerto Rico, despite having equally spectacular beaches and a climate similar to the island next door, could boast only one luxury hotel, the Condado Vanderbilt Hotel, until 1949, when the Caribe Hilton was constructed, and it was constructed at the behest of the insular government. Americans were evidently still hooked entirely on Havana, until the mambo came to an end. Although from the start there was tension between Cubans and Americans, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 assured the breach of America's romance with Cuba, although it made the island a much more desirable girl. Much like when desire increases as the object is within reach but unobtainable, Cuba is once again the forbidden fruit that must be reacquired at all costs, punishing the ungrateful barbudos with invasions, blockades, assassination plots. And it was no wonder. By 1958, Cuba was not just the go-to amusement park for grown-ups from the U.S. American capital controlled a large portion of the island's economy, including 90% of the electric and telephone industries, 83% of the railway commerce, and 43% of the sugar business. Till the Cuban Revolution ended, of not being all that was promised or expected, it established another significant difference between Cuba and Puerto Rico that lowered Puerto Rican cultural value. There's no doubt that the masculinity of Cuban men at arms was a turnoff for the American government, and particularly its elites, but it just as well attracted sectors on the left and minoritized intellectuals who regarded the revolution as a direct challenge to the racist and colonial policies of the U.S. If for many, revolutions are the equivalent to political Viagra, the Cuban screw you to the U.S. from only 90 miles away of the Florida coast was irresistible. Of course, we have things like this. What's more, the revolution raised Cubans to the level of international sex symbols. And this new status added symbolic ingredients to the Cuban ajiaco that many couldn't find in the Puerto Rican asopao. From that moment on, Cuba became the privileged place where a poor nation had confronted the most powerful military in the world in a fight for freedom and emerged victorious. While most people live like they assume Puerto Ricans do by nature, bregando, outsmarting authority in order to survive, they dream of being more like the Cubans are assumed to be by definition, defiant, macho, and rebellious. Now, of course, the single image that says that is not of a Cuban, but it's an interesting story how it got to be that way. While Cuba became a global brand, Che certainly being, in fact, this very photograph is the most reproduced photograph in the history of photography. The modest attention Puerto Rico received at the time can be summarized by the 1958 cover of Time magazine, featuring then Governor Luis Muñoz Marin posing with a stern look. There, the island is sold not in erotic but in clinical terms, like a laboratory, this time about democracy in Latin America. Now, just to give a bit of a contrast of how unsexy this looks against this, Camilo Cienfuegos versus Luis Muñoz Marin. According to supporters, the case of Puerto Rico demonstrates the good that capitalists can be. In only Latin America ends the hostility towards investment by the U.S., offers incentives, and rejects nationalism. Clinical or otherwise, the experiment soon lost funding and entered into a permanent crisis. Other than the fact that the Puerto Rican economic miracle didn't last long, it required the exportation of 700,000 people to provide cheap labor in New York and other coal metropolitan cities to even work. Of course, this is a classic moment. Paradoxically, even though Puerto Rican migrants were received as dregs from the tropics by a large number of New Yorkers, their origin below the equator, or someplace down there, made it easier for them to be considered a new incarnation of a hot sexual otherness in the United States. After 1959, however, and this is an interesting paradox, the Cuban situation actually lowers the sexual capital of exiles. Whether considered model minorities as the first wave of exiles or the lumpen proletariat after Mariel, Cubans in the United States rarely earned the title of most sexy. with the partial exception of those who Afro-Latinize themselves through hip-hop. Is Pitbull sexy? You're gonna get very contradictory discourse about that. But some people think he's kind of dirty sexy or something. So it is used, the term is used. What is sexy is reserved collectively for those Cubans who remain in Cuba, not the ones that are outside of Cuba. So in other words, Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico are not sexy, but they can become sexy in the U.S.
True.
Cubans are not sexy in the U.S., but they are if they stay in Cuba. Therefore, location is a major part of what, or context of how people in the United States view the attractiveness, cultural, political, and otherwise, of both groups. Given this history, it is predictable that in the last 2 years, as relations between the United States and Cuba have quote-unquote normalized, the same erotic rhetoric has returned as a vital component of the rapprochement. Through the island no longer appears in the image of a black child ignorant of the complex world of politics or a Creole damsel waiting for her prince. There is no doubt that the party is back. In the first few months of 2015, dozens of influential American magazines from GQ to The New Yorker and hundreds, if not thousands, of images depict this new era of American obsession with Cuba like a dance, accompanied by what else? Rum, cars, cigars, and light-skinned mulattas. This is GQ. Bobby Cannavale in Cuba, half Cuban, half Italian. This is Conan, who dedicates an entire show to Cuba, and tries the cigars, tries the rums, and so forth. Actually takes a dancing lesson. This is actually a photograph of an exchange program of college students in Cuba, but it seems that it's being promoted fairly in the same manner than others. The motivation now is not so much to restore the border with Cuba, but to revive the pre-Castro fantasy, which actually never quite disappeared in commodity culture, and reconquer the last nearby market not yet deeply penetrated by capitalism. Mouth water with so much disaster to finance. And it is to be expected that in all this bacchanalia, the cardinal metaphor imposed itself once again through the word sexy. To learn how the Cuba Libre came about, not the piña colada, is described as sexy. To invest in rundown urban areas in Havana, of course not in San Juan, is sexy. It's even sexy to invite university students to study the biosphere in Cuba, says the professor. Cuba is inaccessible. It makes a trip sound much sexier, don't you think? I mean, this is literally a quote. Americans can attempt to pick up where they left off for at least two key reasons. The revolution was, among other things, a clear response to American domination. But the activity of the mediated republic and the institutionalization of the revolution allowed the United States once again to call itself a savior and a friend. With no irony whatsoever, Americans can sing along with the chorus of the Boricua guarachero singer Daniel Santos, Yo no sé nada, yo llegué ahora mismo. I have no idea, I just got here. With Puerto Rico, however, it is impossible to perform this psychological twirl, particularly now, as the economy is on the verge of collapse and the island spills over into Orlando, Philadelphia, and the Bronx. Now, if you follow these picture books, you'll see that there are many picture books in which Cuban ruins are depicted as beautiful and attractive. Now, if you notice the way that Puerto Rican ruins are treated by the collapse of the economy, it kind of looks like this. And it's not meant to represent some kind of timeless beauty, but disastrous, irresponsible government by the locals. In other words, the fact that after almost 120 years of legal sovereignty, the self-designated largest democracy in the world has failed to provide what it promised once ashore, prosperity and freedom, makes Puerto Rico an uncomfortable matter for Americans. If Cuba is a colorful fantasy that lasts and lasts like a lifesaver's fruit drop, Puerto Rico today is a nuisance, like a wad of gum stuck to the bottom of a shoe, reflecting back at the U.S. an image of itself which we cannot identify with. Just another country that exercises power not for the good of humanity, but to advance its own interests. And you'll notice the American public discourse about its interventions abroad are always couched in that it's going to help humanity. In the end, the irony is that being sexy or not, and following different path of reform and revolution through the peephole of their good neighbor, Cuba and Puerto Rico ended up in a pretty similar place, ruined. Although once again, the U.S. has eyes for only one of the two. The danger is that, as the theorist Gilles Deleuze wrote, if you're trapped in the dream of somebody else, you're screwed. That is to say, it is possible that possession without passion adds salt to the wound. I think Puerto Ricans might agree with that. But there are, however, amores que matan. Thank you.
So I have a few questions for Frances, and I would like to have a conversation with her briefly, and then we'll open up to you. I'm very fascinated by this topic. I myself also worked on gender and sexuality, but in the Dominican Republic, and I'm particularly interested in their relationship to U.S. policies and the impact on the Dominican Republic. So what I've learned from my research and what I see is happening in this topic in particular, which I have known that I've been working in this area, is just how important it is to attend to sort of the gendered and sexualized imaginaries that accompany political processes and policies, particularly when it comes to how the U.S. approaches and imagines other cultures. So what I have not done so far is try to trace these kind of imaginaries across time, right? And so it's very ambitious actually what you're doing. You're going all the way back to the 19th century and you're looking at them now. Could you just say a little bit how you put this all together in terms of how you see I guess mostly sexuality, but where gender come in, like how did it emerge as like a key thread to put these two stories together for you?
Well, it's hard to miss, I think. I mean, as someone who studies visual culture and popular culture, I think the first moment that you notice some of what's going on is that there is a visualization of these relationships. And the visualization of these relationships are fairly overt in their gendered and racial dimensions. Interestingly, in some of the caricatures that you see now about the rapprochement, almost all of them are dancing. There's like Obama dancing with Raul or Obama dancing with a local woman. But one of the interesting things about the arc of this story is that because Obama is black, there is this unsettled racial dimension to these new images in contrast to the ones at the beginning. So the gender dimension actually is not that different in some ways, although there's also a homoerotic. There are many caricatures where Obama is dancing with Raul. But the racial dynamics are a bit different from the beginning. Although you still see some darker skinned women in the picture that are representative of Cuba, there are other coordinates that weren't there before. So I think when you start or your attention is first caught by the visual record, I think you can't avoid it. And then when you go to the discursive printed and other songs and other matter, you see those reinforced.
I was asked also, if I understood your final sentence correctly, the interesting conclusion that you have is that whether you're sort of sexualized or gender in particular ways in imagination, that can have negative effects, but the opposite also, sort of the seeing Puerto Rico in not comparable terms, also said something about how the wounds in this.
Yeah, I mean, there are many issues. I think one of them is that the Cuba-U.S. relation was before the revolution was certainly a complex one, but in many ways, was toxic. The Puerto Rico-U.S. relation is also toxic in a different way. So it actually doesn't matter if they think you're really hot or not that hot at all. The larger designs, so the way that is encased and delivered is different. However, in certain ways, the consequences might be very similar. Now, I'm also working on a piece about the Latin beauty stereotype in the U.S. in American media, and finding that it's indeed a very contradictory technology. In other words, I'm doing a similar genealogy from the beginning of the silent era to the present, And definitely, I can tell you for sure that the only the only movie stars or media figures that actually get to have some degree of control over their careers in the post World War the 90s, I say starting in the 90s, are those women playing the beauty stereotypes, the Latin stars. So in that regard, the alluring figure, under certain conditions, I would say that this is what I would have to add to the earlier assessment. Under certain conditions, can be a contradictory technology of negotiation. But if the conditions are not present, then it matters very little. Then you're incredibly vulnerable. Your beauty, your seductiveness can be make you also terribly vulnerable.
I think that leads me to another question that I had, or something that struck me in your talk, is about the relationship between the diasporas in the U.S. and the island cultures, so Puerto Rico and Cuba, and how you mentioned how their portrayal changes of, Puerto Ricans are seen more sexy in the U.S. imagination versus Cubans, and I mean, a lot of that happens through performance, right? So it does not necessarily mean that the success that Puerto Ricans maybe have in popular performance translates into more power necessarily.
Right. Not necessarily.
But the other thing that interested me in that argument is also because if you are in the field of Hispanophone Caribbean studies, if you are, and as I am, there's quite a lot of debates in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean intellectual cultures about tensions between island and diaspora. But the U.S. Have writers, whether they are Cuban or not Cuban or Puerto Rican, the same with Dominican writers, like whether they're like Juno Diaz, should he be considered a Dominican writer or not? And these debates always are seen often a little bit more in isolation from U.S. discourses, and your talk really made me think about and how far we need to figure the U.S. dynamic into these ongoing intellectual debates about the relationship between diaspora and home island, with Puerto Rico, Cuba, or the Dominican Republic, that perhaps cannot be separated from these broader dynamics. I don't know how that works for Puerto Rico.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I understand exactly, but I think that it's almost impossible to not integrate the various gazes, because, for instance, the Puerto Rican gaze on Cuba is from Puerto Rico might be different from here, and all the variables of that from all points of view. So in that regard, I would say that definitely the U.S., the various stages in which these performances are taking place and for various different audiences are definitely important part of the complexity of it. Yeah.
And so another train of thought that I had is, how can we fit the Dominican Republic into this conversation? I mean, it sits sort of literally in the middle, and I tried to think through it a little bit, like where would I place that in relationship to your conversation? Of course, the Dominican Republic was independent before Cuba,
right,
and has a different relationship to the U.S., but it's interesting because so many things that you mentioned are very much echoed in the Dominican case, I would say. So how the U.S. not only imagined, but really literally carried certain policies out and was very much gendered and had a lot to do with masculinity. And masculinity is a term that came up in several times, so that it was perceived also by Dominicans, not only by the U.S., as a possible emasculation. And that there are sort of long-standing effects of how Dominican masculinity has been imagined since that responded also to this dominant U.S. imaginary. Mm-hmm. And there's also an interesting switching between how the U.S. either feminizes these islands, and then at times, instead of feminize it, and you mentioned that too, infantilize it. So there's an interesting switching up between portraying them as a child or as a woman, right? And then often the child is racialized also, perhaps in more, obvious ways than, or stronger terms than women. So that's one of the switching between feminization and infantilization is something that I've been very, very struck by. I don't have any further thoughts of that, but it's something you also
Well, I think in the U.S., what's interesting is that if you think about it, Puerto Rican identity emerges into, popular culture in a big way through West Side Story, first on Broadway and then in film, where Puerto Ricans are introduced as a distinct class of people in the United States with certain kind of attributes. They're gang members, they dance good, whatever. Certain types of attributes. And Cubans have had also a number of moments of visibility in popular culture during the Good Neighbor policy era, and then later even with a film like Scarface that introduces the Mariel exodus. So there are very identifiable moments where these two groups are recognized as such by popular culture. Dominicans have not had that moment yet at that level in the United States. At the same time, though, it's interesting that in New York, where Puerto Ricans don't exist anymore, really. I mean, over the last decade, most of the organizations had Puerto Rico or Puerto Rican in its title have changed it to Latino. So there was a moment where if you read, for instance, the New York Times in the 70s, you see very frequent particular references to Puerto Ricans and Puerto Rican communities, and now it's Latinos. And so Puerto Rico, I think, as a distinct, separate identity from in the U.S., is not the same. While Cubans, because of its ties to Cuba, which is still seen in a Cold War, through a Cold War lens by U.S. media, are still a distinct group. But having said that, though, it's interesting that in New York, when you think about In the Heights, or you think about the success of Gino Diaz, Dominicans became the new incarnation of Puerto Ricans. It just hasn't gone national yet. It hasn't been, there hasn't been a juncture of recognition of Dominicans as a distinct type of Latino that presents either some kind of specific challenge to American culture or politics. Now that might shift in the future. I know, for instance, there is one Dominican family sitcom in the works at NBC. So if that happens, who knows if Dominicans will have their national moment finally, and that what will that look like? So in a way, I think that Juno's success has something to do, not entirely, but a part of it, is that he is not Puerto Rican, and he's not Cuban, and he's not Mexican. He's a distinct otherness that's not very clear, in a way.
It has come to stand in, I think, at times, Latino masculinity is understood.
Absolutely. But in a way, there's no deep, or it's not even a deep reservoir of a stereotypical knowledge to understand Dominicanness at a national level the way that these other groups, there is a deep knowledge. And the one major Dominican movie star, Maria Montes, never really made any film that had anything to do with Dominicans. She was the queen of the B film. She played a lot of Arab princesses in a sarong.
So maybe we'll see if there are any questions from the audience, additional questions, comments.
I don't know if this is relevant at all, but I'm thinking that in U.S. history of masters and slaves and biracial country, Cuba fits that pattern more than Puerto Rico, because you have white Cuban landowners manipulating mulatto women in Cuba. So the U.S. has always identified with the Cuban exploitative relationship to the blacks. And so it made Cuba more sexy than Puerto Rico. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, Puerto Rico had a plantation society. It had slavery, so in that regard, no different. It had a white Creole and Spanish class, very similar. It's a different scale. It was a smaller scale economy, but I think a lot of those dynamics were very similar. So I don't think that would necessarily account. Interestingly, though, if you read these little, articles that were present in the press during the time of the Spanish-American War, you'll find with some frequency American journalists saying that Puerto Ricans are whiter than Cubans. And that made them somewhat more desirable, not necessarily sexy, but somewhat more desirable in the sense that they're not going to create trouble for us. And there's many caricatures that represent Puerto Rico as a little Uncle Sam, like a little baby Uncle Sam, mini-me. Which also suggests that one difference that I didn't mention, but I think it actually has something to do with this distinction, is that Cuban culture seemed to Americans as more authentic, as more different, and in that regard exotic in some ways. Well, Puerto Rican culture seemed more modest, but also, and maybe because of more modest, more easily assimilable to American culture and to American, to a point. In other words, in the sense of being not a threat or not a major threat. So I think it doesn't seem that it's so much that there's a difference in the, there are differences, but not, structural difference in the sense that one country experienced slavery and exploitation and the other one didn't. but more what Americans made of the particular cultural production that emerged from that.
What about Cuban movies that sexualize the country much? I mean, there's not much of a... Many movies that came out of Cuba sexualized their culture all the time in American mentality.
I mean, the movies produced in the revolution are by the CAIC. I'm not sure they were really seen by the U.S. masses. And they're kind of our house movies. Puerto Rico does have has had made different spurts of movie industry moments. I mean, cinema came to Puerto Rico pretty early. But definitely there hasn't been an history of exportation of Puerto Rican-made films to the United States by and large. Obviously, CAIC also, the scale of production and the quality of production exceeds Puerto Rican production to date. But I don't know that that had a major influence on how Americans view Cubans, given that they would have been circulating in art house, intellectual kind of contexts.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I was interested, I mean, we've all kind of, both of you alluded to the fact that kind of the existence of a sexual rhetoric around these islands doesn't have necessarily a particular political valence. It doesn't necessarily offer more power to the island, nor does it necessarily disempower completely, that it can be negotiated. But I was really struck by kind of the visibility of the sexual relations, and it did in the Cuban case, of the sexual rhetoric. And I'm wondering whether we don't usually, that kind of makes visible questions of like negotiation, consent, and struggle in a way that not having that visible does not. And I was just wondering if having that visible kind of is a way of justifying the fact that Cuba and the United States have had a relationship of negotiation and struggle, whereas, and Puerto Rico as well, but there's a United States vested interest in making that more invisible. But I guess I was wondering if you kind of have a thought about kind of, yeah, what making that visible does, and the way that is kind of conceding a power to the Cuban political system. Since it seems like in both cases, on a sort of on the ground basis, obviously there's sexual and economic exploitation transpiring equally on both islands.
Well, I guess what I was mentioning earlier on my current work on Latin movie stars is that visibility is a complicated thing. On the one hand, for instance, you can think of people, leadership in the island of Guam, who say it would be great to be Puerto Rico, at least they know where it's on the map. So in order to be able to negotiate certain kinds of things, because of their invisibility to the most, and I made a film about Guam that aired on PBS last year, and I had to begin from the beginning. Where is it? What are they called? You know, like you have to start from there, although it's also been a U.S. territory since for the same amount of time as Puerto Rico. So in that regard, obviously visibility concedes a certain kind of starting point in a negotiation. But at the same time, as Foucault would say, visibility is a trap. Particularly when you are you are visible through the prism or the lens of another. Or like Deleuze would say, you are trapped in somebody else's fancy or dream. So in that regard, that's why I insist on the conditions. So just to give you an example, you know, Dolores del Rio was considered the biggest movie star in the world. George Bernard Shaw is famous for saying the two most beautiful things in the world are the Taj Mahal and Dolores del Rio. But she wasn't able to negotiate, you know, the terms of her career. She had to go to Mexico. Now J-Lo, Salma Hayek, Sofia Vergara, all these movie stars can now negotiate things that were impossible before, because there's a shift of demographics. There's a shift in the gaze of the market. They are, you know, so they can then turn that visibility or leverage that visibility into a capital, a different kind of capital of influence. But if you don't have the conditions, visibility leads you nowhere because you're trapped in the other's gaze, you know, so to speak. So it's not either a blanket advantage or disadvantage. And on the other hand, if you take Foucault's statement further, sometimes invisibility allows you autonomy, and that kind of visibility. And I think a lot of Native American leaders and cultural people working in cultural practice would say being visible can be very toxic. Because it depends on how you're seen and what kind of power you have in that game of looking. So,
how would you read the invisibility of Puerto Rico in the period that you're looking at, kind of pre-1950s? Like, do you think that there was any power inherent in that invisibility? It doesn't. I mean, you know, in line with the argument you were making.
well, some
just
people
now.
in Puerto Rico would argue that invisibility is good because it allows for cultural autonomy in some ways and preserves certain kinds of practices. On the other hand, it was that limited visibility that allowed for at the end failed project on modernization, although maybe you can argue all modernization projects are failures, but dramatically failed project of modernization in Puerto Rico to happen, and all the contradictory consequences that that's had. Now, I would tell you that I just released a report on Latinos and media mergers, where I looked at 2 years of NBC nightly news to see what the news are about. I can tell you this. Only 1.8% of the news were about U.S. Latinos. 3% were about U.S. Latinos and Latin America. 64% of any news item that mentioned Mexico or Mexican Americans was about crime. And 88.9% of any item mentioning Puerto Rico or Puerto Ricans was about crime. Every time Puerto Rico was mentioned, it was about crime. So in that regard, it seems like, you know, yeah, we're a little visible in this particular way. What kind of capital do you leverage from that? Limited under current conditions, I would say.
Just from a different point of view, I was in a talk like a year ago here, and the Cuba situation was starting to improve, and it was not what is now, but it was much better before Obama announced. And there was an investor that he was like, okay, we're gonna start investing in Cuba now. And I asked him, why are you gonna do that now? You don't know anything. I mean, and the answer is like, we wanna be the first of a change, which I think the thing with Puerto Rico is that there's nothing that you can foresee in the future that can change. Is that true? Is that structurally that?
It's an interesting, I mean, I would say that to me, I first felt that a crisis, I mean, not that I'm prophetic or anything, but I had a feeling that a crisis was coming about 10 years ago, before this, and not even looking at the economic indicators. And it was when I started to perceive that a growing number of people in Puerto Rico that were part of my family, friends, colleagues, started feeling that there was no hope for Puerto Rico. And I think that's actually what fuels the exodus, more than the actual economic, I mean, the economic challenges are real and they're there, and people are having trouble finding jobs and so forth. However, if you look at the big scheme of things in Puerto Rican history, we've been poor more often than not. So that's not necessarily a new phenomenon, and the rates of poverty haven't really changed in the last 120 years. The type of poverty has changed, but not the rates of poverty. So I think it's actually that hopelessness that fuels the exodus, and that also accounts for how, if you compare Puerto Rico with Greece or Spain or other places, Argentina, that have faced similar financial crises, that there's no mass mobilization in relation to the crisis.
Right, that's.
Now, when I've been in Cuba, and I was in Cuba relatively recently, and you go to a paladar or to a small business, you can feel people's hope. So it's not only Americans feel Puerto Rico is hopeless. I think that that's not so much that Americans feel Puerto Rico is hopeless. It's that they don't want to confront what Puerto Rico means. I think that's more the issue. From the Puerto Rican point of view, though, I do believe that people have come to the conclusion that this will never change. so better save myself than invest in saving this, which is unsavable. Well, in the Cuban case, it seems that although people are very frustrated by many things, that there is much more of a sense of things can change, they will change, and the potential will get better. Now, that's not stopping also somewhat of an exodus from Cuba to the United States.
Right.
So there is, and the dramatics of the Central American Cubans stuck in Central America, I think, is an example of that. But there's also a feeling of hope among some sectors that I feel in Puerto Rico is hard to find. Not that there isn't. I mean, there are people that are going to stay there no matter what, and are going to want to see it through. But a large number of people, hundreds of thousands of people, don't feel that way. Yeah. And they're going to swing Florida so hard.
I've got an observation and a question. So, I was really sort of interested in your sort of reference to West Side Story, because some people conceive that as being sexy in one way, but also sort of dangerous in another. And it's sort of the Cuban as a fetishization of sort of Cuba. I think sort of I saw references to the way that Cuban boxers in terms of masculinity. So Teofilio Stevenson in the 1970s and 80s became this sort of iconic figure. Because of his masculinity, because he was very good, and also resisted the temptations of the states to turn professional and have these contests with Muhammad Ali, exaggerated that sense of Cuban mystique and danger, which I thought was quite good. The question is whether in the future the terms of Cuba being sexy and Puerto Rico not are going to change because of the transitions that you've hinted to, but also in terms of the impact of transnationalism and dual identities that many people have, whether that's the sense of sexy and unsexy is going to be eroded by the migration or transnationalism or economic change. I think it builds on the previous sort of question. So what prospect is there for a switching to take place?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball or anything, but
No, you don't.
but what caught my eye was how we're talking about 2015, right? Actually, there was a New York Times article that I was amazed by, which was talking about when Kerry went to Cuba and they were going to bring up the American flag in, they brought some of the men that were there earlier, before the revolution, to accomplish the task. And it was a piece of pure nostalgia about how great it was when the U.S. military was in Cuba before the revolution, without a hint of any kind of reflexivity or critique. So what caught my eye about this string of articles last year and the year before was how the U.S. could kind of literally get back into the conga line again with a fairly small cost in the sense of assessing what were U.S.-Cuba relations. In other words, the revolution keeps being this thing that happened that came out of nowhere. And now it's just withered away because, you know, those Caribbean folks, they're not great at governing, which is kind of the same narrative applied to Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and so forth. So I think that what caught my eye is how easy you can kind of go back to that space and revitalize it to facilitate these next steps. Whether that's going to take hold, I mean, some of the caricatures, and I think caricatures like music and cinema are somewhat, those are prophetic. They can't articulate relationships before we actually have a vocabulary to talk about them. So if some of these caricatures that say that Cuba's going to look like, you know, McDonald's, Macy's, whatever, and that's going to make it so similar in a way to the United States that it's no longer going to be able to be represented as authentic, different, and exotic. That we'll see. Not sure that's going to happen. I have a sense that the insertion of the Caribbean in general to the global economy is so fragile that in a way that fragility will maintain certain types of difference for a long time to come.
As a treating psychiatrist
Yes.
of Cuban descent, certainly I see this stuff playing out. I mean, let's talk about treating depression amongst Cubans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans. I mean, even dosing the patients, you find that it layers. The
There's a
Cubans,
hierarchy?
Yeah, the Cubans, 20 milligrams or something will do well, whereas with the Puerto Ricans, dosing becomes even a severe problem. And so it's even generational as you look at it when you treat it, which is to me sort of, it's truly amazing. And this is something that sort of we go through our heads constantly, like, so why is depression playing itself out in one subset of the population in such a severe way? We hospitalize them more at PI more than any other population.
Puerto Ricans.
Yeah. Then we see Dominicans and Cubans come in. And when you meet with the patients and you start these discussions, that came down from 168 here to just hear some sort of something new that perhaps could take back on the unit to talk about, well, these are some of the dynamics that, I mean, certainly the literature says certain things, the literature that we read about treating the pathology of the population that we work with, but it is truly amazing the way it plays itself out on the behavioral health side. And how we try to work with it to improve the pathology of our patients when they come in. It's just truly remarkable.
Can you say your name? I'm sorry. Can you say your name?
It's Alvaro Silent.
I think one of the things that to that effect, that I've spoken to a number of journalists that have covered the crisis in Puerto Rico, that are not Puerto Ricans, they're Latino, Mexican Americans, other Latinos. And they tell me something very interesting, which is that when they try to cover the crisis and they try to communicate the depth of the crisis, it's actually challenging. And there's a reason, because nobody seems to think they're a crisis. So I think part of the depression, if you will, and we're going to talk about those in those terms.
I'm sorry, that's my word.
I'm just saying, but we're trying to talk about what's the pain? Where's the pain? I think part of it has to do with a context which makes it really, really difficult in a way to call things by their name. I mean, even the very political vocabulary we have to talk about Puerto Rico is completely obfuscating the terms of power and the relationships. And there's so many interests invested in some of these lack of clarity that it becomes a very difficult labyrinth. Or if you look at when I experience here as a professor at Columbia and I see students, Puerto Rican students, not all of them, not you. I see a lot of Puerto Rican students come to my office and I feel in a way that they're starting from point A, every generation starts from point A, trying to acquire a vocabulary to be able to understand what's going on. And I think of myself, 30 years earlier in the same place. And I don't experience that same situation when an African American student comes to my office, or a Cuban comes to my office, or a Mexican American student comes to my office. There is a sense, there are grasps that there's been challenges, problems, transformations, but there's also been new avenues opened moving forward. I don't experience that, you don't experience that very often in the Puerto Rican context. Sometimes we're mired in a nightmare of trying to articulate and confront the stakes of that articulation.
I mean, that's a good point, because I see that in medical school as well. I see it with that. Generally, we only have one or two, actually, but we see those dynamics as well in terms of the story that they tell, how they got there, what they aspire to become in the state, and how they want to bring that back to make that difference.
What I find fascinating in this conversation is just because this is about the importance of making things explicit and how that might be important for one's psyche. But it's so interesting in relation to the argument you made about visibility, where there was like a little more room for perhaps ambivalence.
Yeah.
Their visibility can be positive and negative, but now and I'm a literature person, so
Sure.
how making explicit here seems to actually have a more important or positive and less ambivalence perhaps than when you talk about visibility.
But making something explicit doesn't necessarily mean it's not ambivalent. You know what I'm saying? In other words, that you can make something explicit and the conflicts might be even more evident, or more recognizable. So it's not necessarily that you make it explicit and everything becomes clear and actionable. And I think both things are simultaneously true, I guess. It depends on what part of the map you're looking at.
All right, I think
We're at two? Okay, all right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
for your time.